Good afternoon, Adam, and thank you very much for giving us some of your time to talk about your recent book.
My pleasure, Henry.
Well, what I thought I'd like to start with is the sort of first, I know it's quite the first half of the book, but the first sort of half of the story, which um, seems to be dominated by the big, if you like, global North oil companies, and ask you about how they managed to dominate the oil industry for a lot of the, I suppose, two-thirds of last century, roughly, or something like that. And then what sort of happened, how the national oil companies then sort of fought back, if you like, or the countries fought back. But if we start with what were the tricks, what were the strategies for the big oil companies from the beginning?
Well, as you point out, for most of the 20th century, up until about the 1960s, the world oil industry was dominated by just a handful of big Western firms. They were popularly known as the Seven Sisters, seven big Western American and European firms, five of them American, two of them European. And these are the firms that today we're very familiar with: BP, Shell, ExxonMobil. They have their origins in these big seven firms. Now, the key thing to understand about these firms is that they were vertically integrated, which means that they controlled oil from the point of extraction, pulling it out of the ground, through its refining, through its shipping and marketing, and its final sale to the consumer in the petrol service station. So each step of the oil value circuit was controlled by these seven firms.
And what if it's of that sort of value chain? What do you think parts of the value chain were crucial in terms of keeping control, if you like, of it?
Well, it's very interesting to look at this because in the United States, the extraction of oil had many different players beyond just these handful of big firms. Globally, however, these firms really controlled all oil reserves in places like Latin America, in the Middle East, in Europe, and they divvied up the market between themselves. They made sure not to overproduce, which would affect the price. And because they controlled the point of extraction, but really importantly, the point of refining, meaning the point where useful products, oil was turned into useful products, it meant that they could basically set the price. So they also controlled the price of oil throughout most of the 20th century.
So the refinery was the key point, because I suppose if you dig up oil elsewhere, you've got to send it to a refinery. And so how did they, I mean, presumably at the beginning, there must have been various players trying to create that control. How was it that so few ended up taking that sort of controlling role?
A big part of this was control over the infrastructure of moving oil around, pipelines in particular in the initial phases, in the United States, for example. So in the US, the big company was Standard Oil, controlled by the Rockefeller family. And what Standard Oil did was they controlled basically the transport of oil from the oil fields through to the pipelines, and the refining of oil, and the shipping of oil and selling it to the consumer. So that control of infrastructure is really, really key.
And I believe also for the European players, the sort of colonial links was also a factor. Is that right?
In the case of Europe, and particularly here, it was the Middle East that was the key focus through the first half of the 20th century. And at that point, the Middle East was basically carved up by the European colonial powers, Britain and France in particular. And these colonial powers controlled fully the crude oil supplies in places like the Gulf, in Iraq, Iran. So if we look at a company like today's BP, its origins are in control of the oil fields in Iran. It was a government-owned company, basically controlled by the British government, that guaranteed crude oil for the British Navy and elsewhere through the control of Iran's oil. So what these companies did was that they extracted the oil, and then they would pay small amount of royalties to the ruling monarchies in places like Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, and elsewhere in the region.
So what about so governments had quite a role there. What about in the US? Did the American government play much of a role in terms of the development of the US majors?
The US oil companies have always been privately controlled. As I mentioned, Standard Oil was the initial one. Standard Oil was later broken up into different component companies. But Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Texaco, these companies that we know today very well have their origins in those big private American firms, and particularly Standard Oil. So in the US, the state didn't own oil. However, it played a really important role in helping support the growth of the big American oil companies through building infrastructure like pipelines, and also through the military, through the American military, guaranteeing oil consumption for new petroleum-fired military hardware, vehicles, and so forth that really began to become prominent in the First World War, but really in the Second World War, really emerged as the key means of militarism, of war making.
So then we have the key moment when states in the global south, who've previously been paid small royalties, begin to say, maybe I could get more out of this, basically. Is that right? And then is that the beginning of the rise of the national oil companies that we now see?
Absolutely. After the Second World War, we have a surge of anti-colonial national liberation movements, which is a global phenomena. It was throughout most of the colonized global South, and in these countries, movements were aspiring to basically gain their sovereignty, to take back power from the European colonial order. And in doing so, a big part of that was gaining control over natural resources. And in the oil-rich areas, that meant oil. So at this point, we start to see the movements to try to get a bigger share of the oil revenues, to increase the royalty rates, and improve the terms on which royalties were paid. And then most decisively, the nationalization of oil reserves, taking those crude reserves out of the hands of the big Western firms, in particular those Seven Sisters, and that we see that happening in the 1950s, culminating in 1960 with the establishment of OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and here we really see the major oil exporting countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Venezuela at the lead of this, established this organization, which was essentially representing this taking back the control of crude, the underground crude oil supplies from those big Western firms.
So how did the international politics, conflict, and so on play out as these so-called developing countries, global south, sought to gain greater control of their own resources?
This was a moment of revolutions and uprisings all across the global south. And as part of this, these states established national oil companies that took control, as I said, of those upstream underground reserves of oil. So the really important figure in all of this is Saudi Arabia and Saudi Aramco, which in the early days was actually an American or controlled by American firms. But through the 60s and 70s, it became nationalized and controlled by the Saudi government. Now, what's really important to understand here is that even though those Western oil companies lost direct ownership and control of crude oil, they still controlled the other parts of the value chain, in particular the refining and distribution networks of oil. So they might have lost direct control of Saudi oil supplies, for example, but they still controlled the refining and sale of oil to consumers in Western markets. So they still maintained a great deal of power over the entire oil value chain and were made immense profits through that control.
And one of the stories I found very interesting was the sort of battle, the democratic or quasi-democratic battles in these global South countries, which sort of seem to will end up with the authoritarian regimes. But for periods, it looked like it could be more of a democratic opening up of control. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's important to realize that the control of oil wasn't just a question inside the oil-rich countries. It was also a question across the wider global south, across the regions. For example, in the Middle East, countries like Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, these movements where people saw oil as a mechanism for addressing inequality, regional inequalities, and establishing sovereign power beyond just the oil-rich states. So we have here an interesting kind of complexity in the sense that countries like Saudi Arabia, which were authoritarian states ruled by ruling families, ruling monarchies, were themselves despised by nationalist movements in the wider region. And felt themselves under threat. So it was in the 1960s and 1970s, the guarantee by the United States for the survival of those monarchies that really was the key turning point in the systems that we see the state systems that we see today.
So in a way, a sort of, if you might say, a sort of dirty deal was done by the autocrats to maintain power, that they kept supplying the oil in exchange for arms and other support to keep them in power. Is that roughly?
Absolutely, and we see these patterns today. The Saudi monarchy, for example, still extremely strong ally of the United States. And it wasn't just about the supply of oil; it was also about the denomination of oil in US dollars, which is a really important part of this story. Which was again in the 1970s, the Saudi monarchy basically agreed with the United States that oil would be solely denominated in American dollars. So this meant that every country in the world needed to hold dollars in order to buy the most important commodity, oil, on the global stage. So it was an important part of cementing the US dollar's role as the international reserve currency.
And now, what I understood, there's been a shift of these national oil companies to supplying more to Southeast Asia, China, um, and so on. Is that right? And how's that going to affect the dynamics of the oil economy?
This is a really important part of understanding what's going on today. Essentially, what we've seen over the last 2 decades are two major transformations. Firstly, those big national oil companies are no longer simply suppliers of crude oil. They have followed in the path of the Western oil firms in the 20th century in becoming vertically integrated. They are now massive refining companies. They produce petrochemicals. They control oil tankers. They control each step of the oil value chain. So someone like a company like Saudi Aramco is now by far the biggest oil firm in the world, and it's involved in each step of the oil value chain. In fact, last year, the profits of Saudi Aramco exceeded the combined profits of the five biggest Western firms. So it's a massive company. So that's the first transformation, this vertical integration. The second thing that's happened is that these firms, particularly in the Middle East, no longer rely or export their oil primarily to Western Europe or to the United States. They have shifted eastwards. We can talk about an east-east oil circuit that's formed. In other words, the oil and the refined products that are coming out of the Middle East are now exported to China in particular, but also wider East Asia. So the interdependencies are now forming between the Middle East on one side and East Asia on the other, all across the oil value chain. And particularly, petrochemicals is a big part of this.
So where does that leave the Western oil companies? Are they a much diminished force, particularly as a lot of their oil is quite expensive, isn't it, to extract?
It's important not to get the impression that those big Western firms, that the ones that have came out of the Seven Sisters, are no longer powerful or no longer important. They are massively important, but particularly in North America and Western Europe. They dominate the oil markets and the refining markets in the Western states, and less so in the new geographies of oil that I spoke to in China and East Asia. Now, what has happened is that those Western firms, so firms like ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, and so forth, they have moved into either offshore oil supplies, which is much more expensive to produce and also much more dangerous in terms of possible ecological consequences, oil spills, and so forth, and also into shale. In the US in particular, and Canada, the shale and tar sands production, which are again more expensive forms of crude production.
So here we are with this new configuration, while clearly the climate is changing fast, but these oil companies don't seem to be slowing down. If anything, they seem to be dropping any previous commitments they made. How can you compute those two things? I mean, do they expect that somehow with a dangerous climate they will do fine in some way, or that's just life?
They've been very explicit. They intend to keep producing oil and gas. It's important not to leave gas out of this because that is also part of what these oil companies do is they control natural gas. But they are very explicit about maximizing the production of these fossil fuels and the refining of these fossil fuels over the next few decades. In fact, the Saudi oil minister said just a year or two ago that every molecule of hydrocarbon will come out. So they're very explicit about this.
And the recent COP meeting at Baku didn't progress at all on the control of fossil fuels, did it? I mean,
Not at all. In fact, what we see in each of the COPs over recent years is the outsized role of major oil-producing states, particularly in the Gulf of the Middle East Gulf, over the making of climate policy and the obscuring and holding back any attempts to limit oil and gas production. The other important dynamic here, I think it's really useful to point out, is the production of petrochemicals. These are plastics and the products that are all around us. And oil firms, both the Western oil firms as well as the national oil companies, really see in petrochemical production the future of oil. They talk about it explicitly as the future of oil and certainly the biggest growth in demand for oil moving forward. So we see also in the recent plastics convention in Busan in South Korea last week, the successful attempt by oil companies and oil producing states to stop any efforts to limit plastics production because they really see this as the lifeline of the oil industry.
So are there any governments who are actually willing, you think, to try and intervene and change this situation? I mean, China, for instance, obviously is moving on as far as we can see more, is a leader in renewable energies, electric vehicles, etc. Could they change the direction, or what hope of government action is there with this hugely powerful big oil seemingly unwilling to move at all.
Well, one of the arguments I try to make in the book is that under capitalism, that we see a tendency to increase the throughput of energy, the consumption of energy, and therefore the production of energy. And this has been the case over the last since the rise of oil as the dominant fossil fuel in the middle of the 20th century. So I think we need to look at claims around the green transition in this light. And in fact, what we see is growing demand for both fossil fuels as well as other kinds of energy, whether it be renewable energy or increasingly now nuclear energy, because of this tendency to increase the consumption, overall consumption of energy. So in a place like China, certainly there's been a massive rollout in solar and in wind, electric vehicles and so forth. But at the same time, we also see the expansion of fossil fuel production as well. Last year, the world produced more coal than ever before. So even though coal is a smaller proportion of the overall energy mix than it was in the early 20th century, it's still the overall consumption of coal and gas and oil is increasing. So that I think is the main obstacle we face. And then the big question that we all now really need to grapple with, of course, is the demand for energy coming out of AI and data centers, which is where these new calls for nuclear and other forms of energy really play into the expansion of the overall energy mix.
But what about, I mean, obviously, we are already seeing extreme climate change, heat domes, disasters, etc., and we must presume that that's only going to accelerate. And obviously, some countries are more vulnerable, maybe than others. Actually, I believe Europe is one of the worst affected because it's more land than sea, and it's. But you know that you would hope that would create a will to take on the oil producers.
Well, if you look at those big oil producing states, for example, Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region, they actually there was a report that came out this week noting that the impact of climate change in the Gulf is actually several decades faster than elsewhere, than the global average. So, there is this the impending climate catastrophe unfolding in the Gulf states with heat, rising heat, as accompanied with things like floods, as we saw in Dubai last year or this year, actually. So, these kinds of really tangible manifestations of the climate emergency are certainly going to unfold in the major oil producing states in a really massive way. And we're seeing that. It's not something that's happening in the future, it's something happening today. But as I said, the question that these states continue to do is prioritize the production of fossil fuels and the profits that are made from oil and gas production.
Sorry. Sorry about. We'll have to go back from yes. How will these oil-producing states react to the increasing damage from climate change, which we're already seeing? And will governments seek to take action to take on the oil producers?
Well, if we look at somewhere like the Gulf states of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and elsewhere in the region, we can see very clearly the tangible impacts of the climate emergency already unfolding. This is not something that's going to happen 10, 20 years down the track. It's happening today. We can see it, for example, in the floods in Dubai earlier this year, and we can see it in the very high record-breaking temperatures across the region. In fact, there was a scientific study that came out last week or in the last few weeks that pointed out that the expected climatic changes in the Gulf were several decades ahead of the global average. So when we're talking about warming temperatures, what we are going to see in the Gulf is actually going to be faster than elsewhere around the world. So this is a reality. It's a reality of today. However, these states have made it very clear that, as I said, they intend to extract every molecule of hydrocarbon. They don't intend to curtail the production of oil and gas. What they are doing is also diversifying into renewable energies as well, solar and wind in particular, because they see these as potentially profitable markets. But it's not replacing hydrocarbon production through renewable energy. It's adding on to existing and expanding hydrocarbon production.
So, what is your message? I mean, in producing this book, what were you trying to get across? And what would you recommend to the climate change movement, etc., in terms of action or influence that they need to bring?
Well, the primary aim of writing this book was to point out the ways in which oil is so connected to every aspect of our lives, connected to not just the way we drive our cars, which is the way that many of us just think about oil, but also in the material production, the petrochemical industry that surround everything we have in this room, in my clothes, plastics and synthetic fibers are really important parts of how oil became implanted in our daily existence, as well as our financial markets, our food systems, geopolitical power. And once we kind of see this pervasiveness of oil throughout every aspect of our lives, the question then becomes a question of systemic change. It's not just a question of tackling the power of oil or a technical problem of finding a new fuel for automobiles, but it's about restructuring the way that we live our lives, and that requires systemic change. And that, I think, as I point out in the final chapter of the book, is something that needs to come through social and political movements, social and political change. It's not going to come through governments in the ways that we see today. It's not going to come through the platitudes that we see from the big energy producers either.
Yeah, so we've got to get our acting gear and not rely on someone else to save us. Well,
absolutely.
Thank you very much, Adam. That is a lot to take in, and it's certainly, I found the book fascinating. I felt I learned a huge amount. So I'm really grateful for you writing it, and hopefully it will also be listened to and learnt from by many others.
Thank you so much, and it's been a real pleasure talking with you today.